The fantasy stats of the 2021 MLR season have finally been released as league members prepare for tonight's very first fantasy rugby draft in the MLR's very first Fantasy Rugby League. The Fantasy Ruckers Show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode number 3, part 2 of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Thank you for all of our league members and Fantasy Ruckers community members and everyone else tuning in to today's episode. We're so happy to have you. And you may notice it is a solo episode for me today, but Matt and Vandy are not here for a good reason. They're busy in their war rooms doing final fantasy draft preparations. Yes, you heard me correctly, and you heard at the top of the show. Today is draft day, and we couldn't be more excited to get the 2022 MLR season kicked off with this fantasy draft. It's been a long time coming. We've been working on this project for a very, very long time, and to have this day finally here, like we said, we couldn't be more excited. So yes, Matt and Vandy are both busy away in their war rooms doing final fantasy draft preparation ahead of tonight's draft. The draft is happening at 8 p.m. Eastern time. That draft will be live streamed on YouTube, so make sure you check us out on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers for that announcement of that YouTube link for that live stream. The first pick, the clock, will start ticking at 8 p.m. We're hoping to go live at around 7:45 to do a little bit of a pre-draft show, introduce people to the league members, and also kind of do some housekeeping things before we hop into the 2022 draft, and we couldn't be more excited. And it's something that we've been working on for a very long time, and our league members are super excited. They've been giving us a lot of fun feedback about it, to the buildup of this draft. So yes, thank you to everyone who is in our league, who's been providing the feedback and support. And thank you to all the community members, whether that be on Reddit, Twitter, and all the other social media channels. Just been really supportive throughout this whole process, and really didn't know what to expect when we first started this project, but it's been a lot of fun so far in the early stages. So we hope to keep this fantasy rugby thing going, as I'll speak for Vandy, Matt, and myself. We're just trying to make fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR, and so far, I think we're off to a pretty good start. So you also heard at the top of the show that we have the 2021 fantasy rugby stats. Those numbers have finally been crunched out. It took me a while to get the database all fixed up and all the kinks straightened out, but I finally was able to do that, and we now have the stats that I released on our Discord channel. You can find that link to join that channel in the description below, whether you're listening on podcast or whether you're on YouTube watching live. You'll be able to find that link, and it's got some interesting stuff. So you'll want to see that draft day cheat sheet that has those rankings. It's pretty cool. So we're gonna break those down because our league members definitely need those numbers to make any last fine line decisions as they make their picks, because there's a lot on the line. We have $100 up to a charity of someone's choice up for grabs here, so they'll want to be doing the work. And Vandy has said in previous episodes that he will be doubling that amount, so it could become even more. And there'll also be people pushing to beat Vandy in the league standings, because I said in, I believe, the first show that for every team that beats him in the regular season, in terms of standings, whoever finishes ahead of him, I'll contribute an additional $20 to that charity at the end of the season. So yeah, there's a lot of the line. It's going to be pretty competitive. So I'm thinking that league members are going to want every single edge that they can get, and that includes the stats from last season. I was able to finally incorporate all those proposals that we were able to decide on that we talked about last episode. The two big proposals being whether or not we were going to split the scrum half, fly half position and also reduce the point totals for kicking scoring. Both of those were approved by league members. Just looking at the votes here for the kicking ranking, I believe that one was a pretty big landslide with that one was closer with 5 votes going for reducing it, 3 going against. But the splitting of the position, which was surprising to me at least, was actually pretty heavily handed in changing that rule with 7 votes in favor and 1 against. So we have incorporated that into the rankings, and that is all there and set for you. But before we dive into that and I give you and reveal all of that for you, there are some housekeeping things that I want to remind our league members for, especially ahead of tonight's draft. And also for all you out there interested in following along in our league, this will be some important information for you as well as we get into this. This season is going to be a lot of fun, so we hope you follow along. So with regards to tonight's draft, I mentioned the start time. With rules going forward with that draft, it's going to be a 3-minute clock time for each pick, and we're going to pick for an hour here tonight. And then whatever we don't finish on the live stream tonight, we're going to complete as a slow draft, but we'll keep everyone posted on social media and on our Discord channel about what picks are being made. So that will be there for you. And yeah, I think people are just going to be, excited to be making those picks, and whether it's a live draft on the stream or whether it's the slow draft going forward, it's going to be wrapped up by Thursday ahead of Friday's opening match. So there's a lot to look forward to this week. Just looking at some other things here also, we have almost come down to picking Vandy's favorite team. He doesn't know this yet, but I did post some polls on social medias. I got a lot of traction on Reddit actually, which was pretty cool. And of people posting of what team they should choose Vandy to cheer for this season. He said in the previous episode, whatever team that he is given to cheer for going forward, he's going to get that team's going to get a new number 1 fan in him. So it's going to be exciting. A lot of votes coming in. So we're going to announce that on the draft show tonight, and we'll see whether or not that changes any of the his thinking's going forward. If he's biased towards that team, maybe he'll want a guy on that. That always happens. I mean, in fantasy football, you always skew towards some of your favorite players. So we'll see whether or not that does anything for him as well. With that being said, I think it's time to move on to the fantasy rules and the fantasy rankings, just to do a highlight recap. Make sure you hit us up on social medias, like we said, at the Fantasy Ruckers. Look out for that draft time and that draft link start 8 p.m. That will be released. There will also be an announcement for the draft order coming out after this podcast, so that will be interesting as well to see who will pick where. So that will be released on socials as well. And yeah, just follow, like, and join in on the journey of making fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR, because so far it's been a really fun one, and we've loved having you along. So as we say that, I'm going to bring you guys over here and show you some of my screen. So if you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see this. If you're listening on our podcast, I'll try to explain this as best as possible. But I just got the cheat sheet up on the screen of what I sent our league members and what I will be sending to everyone in our Discord channel so that they are up to date with everything that the league members are using. So just as a recapper, one of our league members asked if he could get a recap of the scoring format and kind of the rules going forward. So it is a 8-team total, just as a reminder for everyone listening, an 8-team league. It's going to be weekly head-to-head point scoring. And those points have been determined to include things like tries, try distance, try assists, of course, conversions and penalty kicks, and then minutes played in the match, yellow and red cards, and things like that. If you are on YouTube, you'll be able to see those values there. We've explained this in episodes before. So if you are on a deeper look into the fantasy rules that we decided on, go have a look at previous episodes on YouTube and everywhere you find podcasts. But just as a refresher for position wise, it is going to have 15 total slots, 10 total starting positions. We have 4 forward positions, 4 back positions, and then one kind of team-based position, kind of similar to a fantasy football defense. We explained this last episode, so you'll see that on your screen. So that's just a little refresher of how kind of the structure will be for this fantasy league. The specifics are in our Discord channel and explained on previous episodes, but you see a little quick reminder there on our YouTube screen for you guys watching the video. So let's move on. It's the big thing now. It's the 2021 rankings. And I know you guys have been waiting for this. I've already released these stats to our league members, so they have seen it and been able to dive into it, at least for a little bit here. But I'm just going to break it down and kind of give you my thoughts of what I saw throughout the process of collecting these stats. Just to give everyone a refresher, I had to tally the stats for, I believe, over 485 players that played or appeared or dressed for at least one match in the 2021 season. So if anyone was interested, a total of 487 players on all the 12 different teams for last season dressed up for an MLR match. Kind of an interesting tidbit there. But yeah, it was a lot to go through, but it was also a lot of fun. I got to watch basically every single game and really deep dive into it. And yeah, it was entertaining, and it just was a refresher of last season. A lot of really entertaining matches, which is really good to see. So it has me excited for the 2022 season. So yeah, let's do it. If you're on YouTube, you'll see the rankings on the YouTube screen. For you guys listening on the podcast, I will once again explain this for you, but I have released a draft day cheat sheet for our league members, and this includes a whole wide variety of stats that will help our league members make decisions into the picks that they will be choosing in tonight's draft. I got total points rankings, top 200 for that, top 200 for points per match, which I think is going to be a huge indicator. I'll get into that deeper in a bit. Top 200 for that. I also have broken down top try scorers, assist leaders, place kickers, players with the most complete 80-minute plus matches. And then we also break it down by position that we have set up in our fantasy league. So front row, second row, back row, scrum half, fly half, center, and back three. So you see it on YouTube screen. It's a lot of people, a lot of players, a lot of numbers, but we're going to break it down for you so it's a little bit more digestible for those of you that are maybe not as in tune with our fantasy rugby league. The numbers that you see on your screen there, which are the actual totals, are the fantasy point totals that we've calculated with the rules that we'll be using for the 2022 season. Once I find an easier way to kind of upload these stats all into one general location, I'll hope to include more information on these cheat sheets, but as of right now, it's just the player name and their fantasy point total. But let's hop into it. Let's see how players did last season. And I think the biggest thing here as we go into it that you'll notice is that rule change from moving from basically reducing all the kickers' points from full points, which is 3 and 2 points for the conversion, 3 points for the penalties, and cutting that in half basically now for 1.5 points for a penalty and 1 point for a conversion, really evened out or I should say nerfed for you gamers out there, the power of kicking, because it was starting to look like it was going to be pretty overpowered in our fantasy league. Not that that's a bad thing. You would just have to draft in that way, but I think it's going to add a little bit of a different element now, having guys that are going to be able to compete with those kickers. So we have a whole mix of them. I'll list the top 10 here. You'll be able to see the top 200 once again on that draft day cheat sheet that is on our Discord. But the top 10 being Jason Robertson, Mike Teo, Bjorn Basson, Angus Cottrell, Bowden Waka, Julian Dominguez, Sam Windsor, Dan Hollinshead, Harrison Goddard, and Dougie Fife. So those are the top 10 fantasy finishes for total points of last year. And like I said, we have a whole wide variety of guys in there. I mean, we have fly halves, back threes, back row players. A position you don't see in there, which is interesting, is the center position. So if you look at this top 10 and even just the higher points totals, if you dive deeper into kind of all the points distributions, you'll notice that a lot of these high scoring positions are going to be, I believe, the fly halves, the back threes, and the scrum halves. Those, I think, are going to be the biggest point scores. You're going to have those different players that are kind of those anomalies that are able to break that barrier, kind of like Angus Cottrell here. He just scored a ridiculous amount of tries this season. So he was able to push himself up there. We may again have a player like that in the 2022 season, but to note our comparison last episode when we compared kind of apples to oranges when it comes to fantasy football, fantasy rugby, it is looking like the fly half position is more of like, and scrum half position more of that quarterback position, and that back three is more of that explosive wide receiver who seems to score a lot of tries. And it's interesting how these players are able to get into the top 10. It's not the same way for every single player. You have your place kickers. I mean, you have Jason Robertson, you have Waka, you have Dan Hollinshead, who only scored, single digit tries last season, but they were able to counteract that with the high conversions and high penalty rates that they had, contributing to a lot of points and pushing them into that top 10. So I think there's a multitude of ways that players are going to be able to succeed in this fantasy rugby format. It's going to be either scoring a lot of tries or kicking a lot of points. But then again, it's also relative position to position. A lot of fly halves are going to kick a lot of points. So the advantage that you're going to have on a team that you're playing against isn't going to be that high. But if you have an Angus Cottrell who is a back row player and he is the only back row player in the top 10, if you have him, he's kind of like that tight end position in fantasy football where it's such a big advantage. Yes, they're not scoring as high points on a regular basis as fly halves or back three players because the try totals are just not there. Well, apparently for Angus Cottrell, it is there. But for a normal back row player, it's usually not there. And obviously the tries are there for the back three and for fly halves and you scrum halves. Sometimes there's kicking, and there are centers that also kick as well, I should say. But surprisingly enough, none of them were made the top 10. So long story short, there's just a wide variety of being able to crack that top 10, which I think the reducing the half point total from the kicking that we decided on had a big thing to do with that, which I think is going to add a lot of excitement to our fantasy rugby league. So that's the top 10 for total points. Like I said, you can see the top 200 on Discord. The cheat sheet has been released. You can download it for yourself and have a look and analyze it. It's pretty interesting stuff. A lot of players on here, familiar names that you'll see. And this leads me into the conversation of the points per match appearance stat line. I actually think this is going to be more important than the total point stat line. It is going to be skewed because you're going to have players in there that just had one really, really good game or two really, really good matches that just pushed their points per match total high. So it's going to be skewed for some players, like you're looking at Coloniso right there. If I just sort out everything here, he only played in 2 matches, but he's second highest. And it's just because he had 2 really, really good matches towards the end of the season that pushed him up there. So you're going to have to take this stat line with a grain of salt. But with that being said, the reason why I think points per match appearance is going to be such a big tool as opposed to what you see in other fantasy sports, especially in fantasy football, because you don't really see a points per match stat line on platforms usually. You usually see projecteds or usually high point totals or total points. But the reason why I say that is because in football, most players, if you draft a quarterback, the likelihood, unless he gets injured, the likelihood is that he is going to play all 17 games in an NFL season. In rugby, that is not the case. A player could be completely healthy and on, I guess, a very, very high occasion match or a very, very important match, they could play. But in a regular season match, if they just need to rest up and maybe take a week off, a team will not hesitate to rest one of their better players. And that does skew the things because you'll have players that are scoring on a regular basis really, really high point totals, but because they just don't appear in as many matches, they just don't crack that top 10. If we looked deeper into it, I bet you we'll be able to find some players in, let's say, the 25 to 11 range that could be in the top 10 if they played a full 16 slate season, but it just doesn't work that way in rugby. So with that being said, that's why I think the points per match appearance is so important. I mean, you look at it here, Joe Peterson on San Diego is a perfect example. He was averaging 8.1 points per match that he appeared in. He only appeared in 9 matches, so he missed a total of 7. So that's a big deal. But his ability from the place kicking perspective when he was in matches was just so effective. So if you did have him and when you could play him, he would be a really effective player for you. But again, that's another element that's added, is that you're not going to have really good players every single week. So it'll be interesting to see how that strategy plays into the whole thing as well. So you can have a look at the top 200. I thought that was an interesting piece to add into the cheat sheet. It might help maybe not be used as a ranking tool per se, but let's say you look at the top 200 and you're trying to decide between 2 players tonight, you could very well refer to the points per match appearance to get a better look at what does that total points actually mean for that player. Is it just a couple big performances? Is it him actually playing on a consistent basis? You'll be able to use that to be a deciding factor maybe between 2 or 3 players when it comes your turn to pick tonight. So that's the points per match appearance. And then we dive into some of the stat categories, and that's being try assists, tries, place kicking totals, which I think is huge because, like I said in the rules, I don't think we outlined this clearly maybe yet, but our league members are aware that every week, it's not that you're going to get the points of a kicker from every single player that you kick. So you can't just load up on kickers, because I think that would obviously be the strategy if that was a possible thing. What we're going to do is we're going to have teams designate one kicker for that particular week. So a team can roster multiple kickers, but on any given week, he will only be able to select one and will only get the kicking points from that player for that week. So I think it's interesting to see, okay, you maybe won't have to draft a few kickers, or maybe you do. Maybe that's a different strategy where instead of having one permanent guy, you just have a bunch of guys that you can just announce based on who plays that certain week. But I think having just the points from kicking separated from the try totals and all the other point scoring was a huge thing. So you'll see that on our screen there, top 20 place kickers from the 2021 season. For you guys listening, the top 10 for the 2021 season, Sam Windsor, Jason Robertson, Taylor Adams, Mac Mason, Dan Hollinshead, Bowden Waka, Hagen Schulte, Matt Gateau, Joe Peterson, and Carl Meyer. So that was the top 10. I listed the top 20 there, and you'll see repeaters from the same team. It's just teams use multiple kickers throughout the season. So that'll be interesting as well, how that plays out. Try assist leaders. This is a big one, an interesting one. So obviously, when I was first going through this, I knew that the scrum halves were going to have a lot of try assists based solely on the fact that they manage the ball the most or handle the ball the most. When I incorporated the rule of the set piece try, where for those of you listening who need clarification on that, in our league, a set piece try is considered when off of a line out or scrum, if a try is scored by one of the members of that lineout or scrum, so essentially one of the 8 forwards or the scrum half, is going to be considered a set piece try. And I didn't realize how many of those set piece tries were going to have such a big impact on this fantasy league. I guess it's just solely on the fact that there were a lot of teams using a lot of line-out mauls in that scoring area within that 5-meter zone that pushed people up. So you see here on our list, and for those of you listening, in the top 4, it goes set piece, Rugby Atlanta, set piece, Rugby New York, set piece, Gilgronis, set piece, Free Jack. So those are your top 4 try assists. So those teams heavily used a lot of set piece plays to score points, at least from compared to the other teams. So I didn't realize that they were going to actually lead the try assist pack over some of these scrum halves. I mean, Danny Tusitala of Old Glory DC is fifth. He's the first player there. He is a scrum half, so that kind of keeps with the range. But that is interesting that some of these teams are going to be competing with players here for try assists. Now, try assists is only one category, and you'll notice in the defense rankings when we get to it that it is nowhere near what the point totals that players score because they don't get tries. But I think it will be a huge advantage if you have a team like, Rugby Atlanta, who has 12 try assists on the season versus the Old Glory DC, who have 7. So almost double of that. And you have to remember, try assists are, 2 points per. And when both teams have the set pieces that are going to be low scoring, it's going to be an advantage if you can have one that consistently scores a little bit higher every single week. So that's there too. Top try scores. I believe you can get this information on the MLR site, but I calculate independently anyways. Top 5 here is Cottrell, Basson, Vandermeer, Malolo, and Mike Teo. I'd love to see Vandermeer up there. He was a big, I was a big fan of his with Rugby Canada and stuff going through when I was growing up. So it's cool to see him there. But yeah, top 25 try scorers, top 20 try assists, leaders, top 20 place kickers. We mentioned that. This is a big one too. I think it will apply a lot to the forwards. I have a list here of the top 40 players with the most complete 80-minute plus matches. I think this will play into a lot of those positions that don't score a lot of tries. And I'm speaking to a lot of the front row players outside of maybe the hookers. I'm talking about a lot of the second row players as well. And maybe even the centers too, because sometimes the centers they just don't score as much or as frequently as some of the other players. They do get try assists sometimes and things like that, and you do have centers that do are heavily involved in the offense and do score a lot, but not nearly, at least regularly, as wingers and some of the other positions. So some of these 80-minute plus matches might be huge for if you have a front row. If you can get a front row guy that consistently plays 70-minute plus matches, or if you can get a second row guy that's playing 80-minute plus matches, you're guaranteed at least a half or 1 point, which I think is going to be huge when it comes to close matchups, especially for these positions that don't score a lot. You'll notice throughout the year that you'll have players, and I need to stress this point too, and I should have started this and said this earlier, but the high scoring point totals that you see in other fantasy sports like fantasy football are not going to be seen here in fantasy rugby. It is a completely different game. So when you see guys getting, only 3 or 4 points, that might be a good thing in our league. That's a horrible thing in fantasy football. But in fantasy rugby, that might actually be a good thing. So you have to look at it through the lens of our fantasy rugby league and our fantasy rugby rules. So you're going to have to, claw at those fine points, I think, if you want to be successful this season. So this is one of those stat categories, the 80-minute plus matches and the 70-minute plus matches too, that I think is going to play a major role, and especially in very tight matchups that we'll see this coming season. And then we get into, as we slowly get towards the end of the show here, we get to the positional players breakdowns. And I've not broken it down by individual position, but by the positions that we will be using in our fantasy rugby league. So that is front row, second row, back row, scrum half, fly half, centers, and then back 3, and then that team defense, team bonus point set piece position as well. So you'll see it on our YouTube page based on the number of players that are available for those positions. Obviously, the front row position is going to have a lot more players that are eligible to fill that slot over, let's say, a scrum half or fly half position. So based on that, I've determined the amount of players to include in the top rankings. So for front row, I've included the top 50. Quickly, top 10 here. Dylan Fawcett. He was incredible this season, by the way. His involvement in the set piece for Rugby New York when it came to within the 5 meter line was just so frequent that he seemed to always be scoring tries. I just love it on the broadcast when they call him the butcher, just slicing through. That's a lot of fun. But top 10, Dylan Fawcett, Sam Malolo, James Malcolm, Hugh Roach, Marco Jans Van Rensburg, Pat O'Toole, Pieter Jensen, Peter Malcolm, Jean-Pierre Smith, and Samu Tawake. So that is the top 10 front row players of the 2021 season. Second row players, we got Johan Mumsen, Aston Fortuin, Tavita Nakali, Joshua Furno, Nathan Den Hout, Corey Daniel, Rhino Herbst. And I got to say, that's one of my favorite names in the MLR, Rhino Herbst. And that is, I have to say, the MLR, I think out of all the sports that I've watched over the years, has to have some of the best names in all of sports. And I'm also very looking forward to having Vandy pronounce some of these names, especially the Maori names and things like that. Matt and I have some familiarity having watching All Blacks games and following Super Rugby and things like that. But Vandy being a new fan, it'll be interesting to see how he is able to pronounce those names. But those are the second row players there. So to wrap that up, top 10, Isaac Ross, Mike Shepard, and Nate Brakely. And then we get to the back row players. Again, Angus Cottrell. Like, look at that difference. And I think that's the big thing that you'll see throughout the entire ranking list when you have a deeper look, is you'll be able to see those disparities and what players are just such a big advantage. So when you look at this, I mean, Angus Cottrell last year for total points racked up 83.9 points. Second place was Cam Dolan on NOLA. He only got 51. So Angus Cottrell is almost doubling. And sorry guys for the barking there. That's at Rucker, our in-house Fantasy Ruckers Show mascot. He's excited for the draft tonight. But yeah, look at that advantage though. So if you have Angus Cottrell, just absolutely incredible. So you'll have to look at these rankings and look at the disparities and the differences. I mean, even look at second row players. Johan Mumsen, like he was a huge advantage. So it's going to be those key players, I think, that will be going in the first round that have just such a big advantage over the other players within their position groups that I think is going to be a key to success for fantasy managers heading into this season. We have scrum halves as well. I passed the top 10 back rows. We got Cottrell, Dolan, Conradi, Wilson, De La Vega, Ross Deacon, Yuri Van Vuren, Hanko Germatius. So even I'm having trouble pronouncing some of these names. Benjamin Benasso and Jason Dam to rank that top 10. But like I said, there's a big gap between 1 and 2 there between Cottrell and everyone else in that field. Scrum halves is pretty interesting. This is going to be one of those ones because we split up the position. It is going to really thin out really quickly in terms of good players at this position. So I have the top 25 up. The top 5 scrum halves of last season were Harrison Goddard, Danny Tusitala, Andy Ellis, Nick Boyer, Michael Baska. But again, the difference between Harrison Goddard at 1 and Baska at 5 is almost 40 fantasy points. Like Harrison Goddard scored 74.6 fantasy points. Michael Baska scored 36.3. And that's only 5 positions. I mean, having a top 25 too was kind of a stretch. I mean, I have players in there that have maybe 1 appearance. We have Fraser Hurst at 25 with 1.5 points. So you see how quickly that's going to thin out. So it'll be an interesting decision, I think, for some league managers to decide, okay, do I get that scrum half because the position just clears out so quickly, or maybe there's a player there like a Cottrell or like a Mungo Mason that scores those high points in a position that doesn't usually score high points. I think that'll be a decision that league members will definitely have to make. Got fly halves. I think that one's a little bit more balanced as long as you get a fly half that kicks. I think league members will be okay. The top 5 there being Jason Robertson. He just, I think, scored more tries than Sam Windsor, but Sam Windsor from a kicking perspective would just he kicked so much, but partly with that because Houston was so bad that they weren't scoring tries, and it was only Sam Windsor scoring points. And then we have Dan Hollinshead, Joe Peterson, and Taylor Adams rounding out that top 5 for fly halves. And then we got the top 40 centers, the top 10 being Ross Neal, Cameron Clark, Mark O'Keefe, Ben Lesage, Threaten Palamo, Varamu Diki Ladi. Another one that's going to be tough. Calvin Whitting, Adam Ashley Cooper, Fa'asui Fa'atai, I think, Ravi Petzer. And anyone can also correct me if I'm butchering these names so bad, but I think we're going to have a lot of fun with this. Those are your top 10 centers. Not as big of a disparity here. I mean, you have Ross Neal, who is number 1 at 69.4 total fantasy points, as opposed to Robbie Petzer, who had 28.5. So it is double, but the point difference itself is only 30 as opposed to some of the other ones. And it does it's a slower drop off from position to position. I mean, it's 53.6 for Cameron Clark at number 2, and then 51.4 points total for Mark O'Keefe at number 3. So there is a closer range there for some of these positions. Just some players just really, really stick out, which I think will be a big factor for the draft tonight and for waiver wire pickups as well going throughout the season. And then lastly here for the positions, we got the back 3 players. Once again, not as big of a disparity. There are some key players that were obviously at the top range there. The top 10 being Mike Teo, Bjorn Basson, Bowden Waka, Julian Dominguez, Dougie Fife, DTH Vandermeer, Yokoin Tukule, Adrian Carles, and Paula Balakena, and Manuel Montero. That was terrible. I absolutely butchered those names. But that disparity is not as big. But once again, high point totals. We're talking about 80 plus points here because of those tries that these back 3 players are scoring. And we also have the team set piece here. Also not as big of a disparity, but I think between the tops and the bottoms is huge. And there's only 12 of them, and there's 8 teams. So we may see a little bit more competition for these lower scoring team set piece, even though they don't play as big of a factor in the league. Apologies once again for the barking Ruckers. Just super excited for this fantasy rugby draft. And lastly, I'll wrap up the show here with one last point here for the season going forward. I will be releasing a roster list of all the players that, or at least that I know of, that are available heading into this 2022 season. I'm going to have a document there for the league members to look at so that they can refer to who's available for this draft tonight. When it comes to position eligibility, how we are going to do this, because obviously these positions change, and that's a big difference between this sport and other fantasy sports, is that players change positions quite frequently week to week. So with that in mind, what we are going to do is we're going to try to start on a fresh slate. So based on what they are listed on the team's website, I will place that down as their eligibility. Now, going forward throughout the season, that is going to change. If a player plays 3 or more matches at a specific position, he will gain eligibility in that fantasy position. For removing fantasy eligible positions, if a player goes 3 match appearances without playing that position, that eligibility will then be removed. So that's just a tidbit factor going forward. But to keep things at a base level for now, at least, I'm going to go based off what is listed on the team's website. Not so much of what I have from last season and what these 2021 stats are based on, solely based on the fact that I think things are changing, players are moving, and what position they played last year and the multitude of positions that they played last year may not be the same positions that they are eligible for this year. So I want to start with a clean slate and use what the teams are saying, and hopefully that is accurate enough, at least for the start of the season. And with that being said, I think that is it. Remember, the draft is tonight at 8 p.m. So make sure you tune in for that live stream. Look out for the link that will be posted on our socials at the Fantasy Ruckers. It's going to be a blast. I jokingly said to our league members that I think as a commissioner of all the fantasy rugby leagues that I've, not even fantasy rugby leagues, but just fantasy leagues, sports leagues in total that I've done over the years, I don't think I've ever been able to schedule a draft day or draft time more easily than what I was able to do in this league. So, hey, maybe that's a good sign of things to come. Obviously, our league members are really passionate, so that's a really good sign to see, and they've been obviously providing a lot of feedback and support throughout this whole process, along with everyone else who's been listening to this podcast. So thank you so much for all of you for your support. And with that being said, I hope to see you all tonight at 7:45 p.m. on that live stream. Matt and Vandy will both be there. We are going to announce what favorite team Vandy is going to be cheering for the foreseeable future, and then have a look at the very first fantasy rugby teams heading into the 2022 season. Thank you so much for tuning in. Rucker says goodbye, and we will see you tonight.
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.